All right, got a great show for you today. Doing a crossover podcast. You probably saw it in the notes with Gavin, Schall, and Alex Wolfe from the Locked On Knicks podcast. We're talking about Kevin Durant. We're talking about the Knicks offseason. We're talking about what it means to be a crosstown rival with these guys. Is there any chance the Knicks and Nets could put together a deal for Kevin Durant? Going to cover all of that. But first, it's the theme music.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Brooklyn, yo.
All right, it's crossover time. The much heated Locked On Knicks, Locked On Nets off-season crossover is here. The animus is palpable in this recording room right now. We're Alex Wolfe and Gavin Schall. We're joined by Doug Norrie of the Locked On Nets podcast. We're of the Locked On Knicks podcast. Doug, I wish I could say that the Knicks had the biggest story going on in the NBA right now, but as we were getting ready to record this episode, Kevin Durant was literally beefing with a primarily Knicks writer on Twitter about whatever, talking about the CBA and whether the NBA is going to lock out, and he thinks the media is rooting for an NBA lockout or something, and all this other crap. But of course, the big story in the entire NBA right now is the whole Kevin Durant saga. I guess so. I do want to talk about if either of our shows think that there's any possibility that the Knicks and Nets could potentially deal with one another on this particular, Kevin Durant issue, as far as, executing a trade, particularly if like Donovan Mitchell goes somewhere else or something like that. But I guess I'll first ask you, like, what has it been like working this saga so far? Because I got to say, every day, Gavin and I, like, every time new news comes out about Durant, before we start recording, we're just like, thank God he didn't choose the Knicks a few years ago.
Well, I was going to say, like, before I'll answer, we'll get to that in a second, but you guys have to just secretly love this, right? Like, just seeing like the amount of discord, seeing the amount
I don't think it's secret for Alex.
Yeah,
okay, I was going to say, like, I feel like you'd be doing your fan base and just maybe the podcast in general a disservice if you weren't like, yeah, this is amazing just to watch this from a Knicks perspective. It's terrible from the Nets perspective.
Yeah, the reality of it too, from a Knicks perspective, at least for me, is like, I don't even think so much, like, I would have still been ecstatic had Durant chosen the Knicks back in 19. Sure. I still was sad when he didn't. I got over it fairly quickly, and the Knicks have had their fair share of success since then. To be honest, they've had about the same amount of success as the Nets have, except for now have all their draft picks and a young core going forward, which is nice. But like, I think the biggest thing is I just think about, like, if both those guys were on the Knicks right now, and if Harden had passed through the Knicks for one season and had things end the way that he did, I mean, we would just have a never-ending storm of garbage coming our way, of just, the national media, like, taking victory laps and everything else. And it would just be a huge mess in that regard. So from that perspective, that's where I'm most like relishing in the fact that this isn't the Knicks, is that, like, if this was the Knicks, it would be a 5,000 times bigger story. And we're hearing about it a lot from the Nets perspective, like with Durant asking out of the Nets, it's still a big national media thing. But I mean, we literally would not be able to go a single day without hearing about this all summer if this was Durant and the Knicks. So that's
what's happening
thing
now. So
yeah.
I think this debate around this comes down to just how it comes down to perception around, like, how to feel about this Durant situation. And I actually never had really considered the part where it's a relatively the same success rate over the last couple of years between the two teams. That was kind of a bummered way for have to be framed in a way that I had, but you're totally correct. I mean, it is, relatively speaking, it's been about the same. I think what it comes down to for me is wondering sort of like what the point of, let's speak from a fandom point of view, like what the point of fandom here is. Is the point of fandom, or, from rooting from a team perspective, to have it just kind of be this steady sort of like straight line, organizationally, and everything's kind of everything's solid and stable. And there's like a peak which you can reach with that, and you can do a really good job. But in the end, it's very difficult to win in the NBA. Or is it not? And these things aren't mutually exclusive. You can do both things, but at the same time. Or in this case, with a guy like Kevin Durant and Kyrie or whatever, is it better to just swing huge and then burn out hard and bright, basically, which is what's happening now? It's like, because they took a huge swing. It was what they had to do in terms of, where they just were draft pick wise, asset wise. Like, they had the ability to do it. I think you signed Kevin Durant 11 times out of 10. I don't think it's that much of a question, but it actually has raised, which I think you're maybe getting at a little bit, is like raised really interesting conversations of like, hey, what are we doing here? Like, is this the point? Is the point to have it be super relevant and then just a total disaster, with the idea that you might win a championship? Because the one difference between these two teams over the last couple of years is the Knicks are not in that conversation, right? Like, they're not in that conversation at all. It's not a knock. It's just true, right?
Yeah.
But so is it better to not be in the conversation, but have things on this like nice steady trajectory up, nice moves, couple nice draft picks, a nice free agent signing or two, and have it be like that? Or is it better to just absolutely go for it, knowing that if it doesn't work, you're going to be in the situation where the Nets are right now, which is just sitting on 18 different landmines, like trying not to move and just explode one of them and have the whole thing go up. So I'm not sure, actually. Like, I'm not sure. I don't know what you guys think, because I think it's really just the trajectories are totally different right now.
No, and I think it's so interesting because as I try not to remind people on this podcast, used to host Locked On Nets, and as someone who was an avowed Nets hater my whole life, I grew to really like the teams. Part of it was that the broadcasts were so great. I loved Ian Eagle, loved Ryan Ruocco, Sarah Kustok. They made it so much fun, but the team itself was just extremely likable. I mean, they built themselves up. I mean, it's kind of what the Knicks have had to do the last couple of years, like from the worst like depths you can be in the NBA. No picks, like no discernible future, a promising market, but like clearly like the second team in that market to a team that was totally dysfunctional. And yet just through like shrewdness for a GM, like who knows, like maybe we'll get fired, maybe we'll still be around. Like he was able to pull that out, find Spencer Dinwiddie out of nowhere, find Joe Harris out of nowhere, get D'Lo on the cheap, Jared Allen in the 20s, Karis LeVert in the 20s, on and on and on. It was a brilliant rebuild. And on one hand, when they first there was talk that they could potentially get KD and Kyrie, I was like, man, I kind of want to see what this team could be. It's so much fun. And you look at it like objectively, and you say, all right, if they had just kept that team together, they would have been really excited about Jared Allen at this point. He would have turned out to be an all-star. Dinwiddie has pretty much become who he is, like a nice player. LeVert, very similar. If anything, he's kind of disappointed me in terms of who he's become. Joe Harris has been hurt. It would have been a team that honestly like would be, I would say, behind where the Knicks are now, like an 8 seed, a 7 seed, like and totally played fun basketball, and like the collective cohesion that those guys had would have been a lot of fun. But like it stops being cute at a certain point, right? So that's why, to your point, like if you're the Nets, you make that swing every time. And we're talking about a team that, I mean, to Alex's point, on one hand, like you look at the pure results, they got one round further than the Knicks have the last 3 years. I think there was a stat out there that like Julius Randle's like total stats over the last 2 years, maybe partially because of injuries, obviously, are better than Kyrie's or better than Kevin Durant's. Like the Knicks have won more games, I think, over the last 3 seasons than the Nets have. Maybe I'm wrong on that. Don't kill me if I'm wrong on that. But anyways, point being, the Nets have gone one round further than the Knicks. On the same hand, one of Kyrie or Harden doesn't get hurt a year ago in the playoffs, and the Nets win the title because they were playing the team that ultimately won the championship, and down 2 Hall of Famers pretty much won that series anyways. So I think to your point, you take that chance every time. But where do you think, I mean, you were just kind of like debating it internally. Like, do Nets fans feel like this total sense of dread now? Or is there this idea like, look, we trade KD, we get a massive package back. We trade Kyrie. At the very least, we get a couple of first round picks. You could argue that they would be in a better position now than they would have been if they had just sort of kept the core of that team, even as badly as this is blown up.
Yeah, I mean, I really don't play any revisionist history here. I was fans of all those moves at the time. I still am. It did not work out, but like process wise, you do that every time. You trade Karis LeVert and Jared Allen for James Harden for 2 years of James Harden. It's like, I know they didn't get 2 years of them, but they should have in theory, right? So you do that and the draft picks. I think you do it every time. The ceiling is just too high. You have a chance. One out of every 30 teams can win it every year. And if that's the goal, then there's really actually no debate about it at all. Anyone that puts it up as a debate, at least with Nets world, I really, really push back against. in terms of like where they are now, I'm still our listeners are gonna probably drive me nuts with this one, but like I still think short of Kevin Durant, like the part where you just assume they trade him is still nuts to me. Like I would still at least entertain the idea of it's like if it's Durant or Marks or Nash, like having real internal discussions about whether those other two guys go, because you have Kevin Durant under contract. If that really is what it is, I don't think that's really what it is. I think there's more to it. So I think that there's like another piece of it. But I do think that gets dismissed a little too early sometimes. Is like, yeah, I know that no one ever wants to cave to the player. No one ever wants to make it so the organization looks dysfunctional, wherever they're already dysfunctional. Like that ship has sailed. They're not going to, no more function is coming in the building once they trade Durant. Like it's already completely dysfunctional. So at that point, just keep the player. In terms of like how they would be better or where they would be in a better spot, I still can't really get behind that because it's Durant and there just are so many years left on the contract. And he is just the kind of ceiling player that you need to win championships or at least compete for championships. You need
Doug,
one of these.
Just to be clear, I'm saying they could be in a better spot now than they would have been if they'd never signed KD after trading him. I think they're clearly in a better spot if they keep Durant.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Okay. Oh, you're going back. So you go back to the D'Lo age. Yeah. They'll still be better than that. Sorry to go long-winded on the question that you didn't ask, but I think they're still clearly in a better spot. They were always moving on that trajectory and Marks was really good at this piece, right? It's like, and to some degree, like the Knicks have kind of done a little of the same thing, which is like figuring out how to package together other pieces to bring in slightly better stuff marginally on the uptick. Like they've been doing this for years. The Knicks seem like they're doing this now. Yes, they would have still been in a better spot because I think they still understood that those other guys were basically overrated. Like D'Angelo Russell was, for what he got paid, is overrated, right? Like Harris LeVert is is really overrated. I like all these guys. Like it's not that. It's just for what they got paid, they're all way overpaid. So yeah, no, they're still going to be in a better spot. It's just like now it's at what cost? Like the cost has been such a price now in terms of loyalty and fandom and culture, which I hate using, but I actually have a question for you on this. Like, so everyone uses culture. I'm sure they're going to start using it a lot with Knicks now too, because Knicks have like made a lot of good moves, right? So, my take on culture, and this is where the Knicks have it maybe, is that culture only means that you slightly exceeded your expectations for what everyone thought you were going to do. So like you have good culture if you're 10 to 15% better than anyone thought. You have bad culture if you didn't get to that point. And that's like all of culture. That's all culture is, because at some point you said you put it great. It's like, it stops being cute. Yeah. At some point it's you reached what your culture level was and now you either exceed it or not. Like, don't you think I think the Knicks are on like that perfect trajectory now where they kind of got a little of it 2 years ago when Randall just shot the lights out. Culture dipped a little bit last year when it didn't look as good, and now they made all the right moves. Does that make sense? Like, do you think that they're on that kind of trajectory now?
Yeah, I think more so than even just like the culture aspect of it for the Knicks. And I do think that they've established, like, if you want to talk about culture, I think it's more about getting a consistent identity on the court.
Yes.
Which I think that especially on the defensive end, for all of his faults, like Tibbs has finally established them as a good defense, which is great. We were just talking about this on one of our most recent pods with our friend Dallas Amico, that like they put out a like top. I think they were one of the top, by certain metrics, they were the number one defense in the NBA post All-Star break last year.
Just by points per 100 possessions, they were
points per 100 and defensive rating and all this stuff. Like, so he's established that. I think that he certainly needs to get more creative offensively, and maybe that's where their next coach does that. But I think that's what I think of more with culture than like this like vapid like organizational culture idea that we've heard, which is mostly how it was related in terms of like the Nets and stuff. But I will say one thing that you said this is something that I know certain people that listen to our podcast probably will hate me saying, but like, I agree with what you said about you have to make that move 100 times out of 100. Now, I don't know if they're quite at the Knicks are quite there yet as far as this like Donovan Mitchell trade, right? I think that you could reasonably say the Knicks have like another year to think about what's our all-in move going to be, which is why I think they're holding out on the Mitchell front and being like, we don't have to give you everything that you want right now, Danny Ainge, because we can just roll this team out here with Jalen Brunson, and our fans are going to be happy because we have new blood. We have the best point guard that we've signed in years, about to start for the team in his prime, not like Kemba Walker last year that was like, wow, we signed a guy who was awesome like 4 years ago. That maybe if there's something left in the tank could be about 70% of that. They're signing a legitimate guy on the upswing in his prime that they can send out there. But I agree with you in the sense of, I say this somewhat often on this podcast, young players and draft picks have expiration dates.
Yes.
There's a point of diminishing returns on these guys.
Yep.
And people don't seem to get that. People look at with the Knicks right now, everybody's like, just trust in the young core, blah, blah, blah. They're all, on their rookie contracts and blah, blah, blah. It's like, but rookie contracts have expiration dates. And once you pass that expiration date, like we're literally before the end of this summer, probably in the course of the next, I don't know, month and a half, we're going to see an RJ Barrett extension. I almost guarantee they're gonna lock that in. And the number is probably going to pay him somewhere around like $30 million a season starting next season, not this coming season, but the season after. And that's all of a sudden, he's not just a young cost control guy anymore. He's a guy that has to live up to a contract. And that's going to happen soon thereafter with Emmanuel Quickley and Obi Toppin. And then it's going to happen with Quentin Grimes and Jericho Sims and Deuce McBride. Like these things are all going to happen pretty quickly. So I think that's something that, and the same thing happens with draft picks too, right? Like a Dallas Mavericks top 10 protected 2023 first round pick ceases being a mystery box after the draft passes. Then it's a player, and that player, unless they come out and really prove something, which I will give the Knicks credit. They've, I think, turned their late first round draft picks into better players than what the draft pick by itself would have been worth. Like Quentin Grimes, I think, is worth a lot more than like the 25th pick in the draft now at this point. But like, there's points where these assets become less valuable and people don't understand that. So they think like, oh, the Knicks are sitting on a treasure trove. Just sit on it longer until the right guy comes up. But sometimes you just got to make that swing, and I don't fault the Nets for doing what they did. Like I said, I literally opened the show saying like, I wanted the Knicks to sign Durant. Everybody did. If anybody says they didn't, they're honestly full of crap. Like,
let me throw this out there real quick, Alex. I think the equivalent of the Donovan Mitchell move was the Harden trade. Like the Durant and Kyrie was just like, yeah, of course. Yeah. Come on in. Yeah. They were short.
But the Harden trade. Yeah. For them, it was to win a championship. For the Knicks, you make the Mitchell trade. And this is probably why they're holding out on not giving up like a Harden level package is like, A, is he as good as Harden was at that particular moment? I don't think so. And B, what do you think your ceiling is here if you make this move? I think that's why they're holding out a bit, but at a certain point you do have to certainly take that swing, because otherwise, if the Nets had just stayed the course with that fun young team, they would be paying D'Angelo Russell, Karis LeVert, Jared Allen, and all those guys, Joe Harris, like all the Dinwiddie. All those guys make in excess of $20 million a year now. That's essentially your whole salary cap right there, just between those guys. And what is the ceiling of that team in 2022?
And then you're just in the wilderness. Yeah, then you're just like kind of in the wilderness and you're kind of treading water. And Gavin, you said it too, like it stops being cute after a while. I had a friend text me the other day and he was totally right. He said the number one way for a GM to retain job security for a long term is just compile draft picks, because then the future can always be there, right? Like the future can always be right down the doorstep. And maybe by the time we're done with this podcast, they unload it, because I saw Shams just said the Knicks and the Jazz are re-engaged in trade talks around Donovan Mitchell. So that just came across the wire
during the podcast
as we were doing it. So maybe by the end, it's all some of this is moot. No, yeah, I think at like some point, right? Like this is what people fail to understand, because people, it's like going back, it's like looking at a past relationship, man, woman, whatever you were like later when you're in a crappy relationship then, and you think back, oh, that was so great. It's like, dude, there was a reason you got out of that. There was a reason before this one, you left that other one. It was because there was like not as much upside. It wasn't totally there. This is what fans sometimes fail to sort of grasp onto, is that, yeah, that was okay. It was never going to be great. And at some point it was going to be the opposite of great. It was going to be massively disappointing, because you were no longer like, look at the Hawks last year. It's like, hey, great little run. Guess what? Now they stink. Same exact team. they don't really stink, but you know what I mean? Like same exact team, expectations were higher, doesn't look as great anymore, not plucky upstart. At some point, you stop becoming the plucky upstart. I think the Nets just fast forwarded that timeline in a way that always seemed correct, but is just playing out in a way, which is when you take big swings, as anyone that watches like Joey Gallo, like when you take big swings, sometimes it's going to look really great. And then sometimes it's going to look horrendous. And this is, I just think it's like philosophically, I think you're totally right though. At some point, the Knicks are going to have to do it. I will say, because it's very hard to win the championship and only one team gets to do it every single year, and the players that you basically need to do it are so few and far between, because there's really only like 6 of them or something like that you basically need on your team. Giannis, KD, LeBron, like the Curry. The list is pretty darn short. RJ Barrett, right? Obviously, Alec Burks, but they traded him away.
Yeah.
So like at some point it's just also cool to be good and super and engaging, and like Mitchell would make you a lot better. So I think there's still a real case, especially if you're like, hey, we're just going to kind of own New York again for a long time, and we're just going to be good, and maybe one year we'll sneak into like the conference, finals or something like that. I think I can see a pretty strong case for that, because like those other guys don't come available all the time. I don't think they have what it takes to get Durant now, to go back all the way back to the beginning, which was the original question. But I think there's a case for it. And I totally get the part where, at some point, the worst place you can be, I think this is what you were saying, Alex, like the worst place you can be as an organization is overpaying like 4 guys. If you're overpaying 4 guys that are your 4 best players, your team is going to be a massive disappointment. And I think that's what most teams want to avoid, is that exact thing. It's like you get married to your own dudes, you overpay them. They're just not as good, because at some point, everyone in the NBA that's good gets overpaid, except for the very top guys. Because, just the way just the way the contracts are. If you're good, you get overpaid. And then there's those other guys that just are underpaid, like LeBron, KD, Giannis. Like those guys don't get paid enough because of the cap, and just because of the rules. But at some point, you overpay those guys, and then everyone it's just not that much fun anymore. So I don't know. Nets fans are I kind of like what the Knicks have done. Is the ceiling super high? No, but at least it like kind of makes sense chronologically, and you can build toward it. And what team in sports hasn't been disappointing for some stretch over the last few years? Like they've all been. Yeah, at some point you're going to go through disappointments. You'd want to just basically see linear growth. And I think the Knicks at least have done that. I think the Nets tried it, and now they're just on the other side of the mountain, coming down at warp speed. We'll see where the bottom is.
Yeah, I think what's so tricky for Knicks fans when talking about the Mitchell trade is just the ambiguity over who the young guys are, and that's both in like a positive and negative direction. And that's sort of, this is what we discussed basically the whole second half of last season, but this is Tom Thibodeau playing in Alec Burks 38 minutes a game coming home to roost. Because if you had started Emmanuel Quickley and played him all season, you started Obi Toppin and played him all season, if Quentin Grimes, when he was healthy, had gotten 35 minutes per game, just almost no matter what, I think the Knicks and Jazz would be starting from a much clearer and more honest place of saying like, all right, clearly Obi Toppin and Emmanuel Quickley are not going to be all-stars, but they're clearly going to be very good players in this league. And instead you're in a place where the Knicks can kind of trick themselves into saying, maybe they know something we don't, that, you know what, we kind of think Quentin Grimes is going to be like one of the best 3-and-D players in the league. We kind of think Emmanuel Quickley, like maybe it's only a 5% chance, but there's a world where he can be an all-star. There's a world where Obi Toppin can average 24 points per game very efficiently. And the Jazz are saying like, these are guys that you're not even playing. Like, even though this is a little dishonest, because I think the negotiation is probably just over the 4 unprotected first-round picks. But if the Jazz are arguing for that second young guy in the trade, and that could certainly be a breaking point for the Knicks, they could be looking at like, why wouldn't you give these guys up? Like they barely played. So I think that's what's tricky, is that we just don't know the value of those guys, because unlike the Nets, the Knicks didn't really embrace that youth model. And they said, we just wanted to be as good as possible next year. And the greatest irony of all that is the best they could have been last year is probably playing those guys more minutes. But Doug, I wanted to get a feel. How do you think this ultimately ends with Durant? Because like you, I've kind of been on the bandwagon all summer. Like I just wouldn't trade him. Like, and he came out and tweeted yesterday, said, I'm not going to retire. That's insane. Like I would play this out. I honestly think the crazy thing with all the Simmons stuff is to some extent, he's a perfect fit for the Nets, but even more so, the Nets were such a perfect fit for him. And I kind of think Brooklyn would be crazy to not see what that could be. unless you just get like that dream Durant package. Like if Jaylen Brown was actually on the table, I would have jumped on that. If I was Brooklyn, I'm dubious that like the suggested trade was the trade that was there. But how do you think this ultimately wraps up?
Man, I've gone so many different versions of this through the summer because I've been sort of convinced. I will say things I never thought. I never thought the Phoenix thing was going to happen even from the start. Like I was like, that one never felt right. I stood firm on that ground. I'm going to keep all the receipts on that one. Hopefully it doesn't happen. Just because of me. Like I don't care about it. Right. Like I don't want to look bad.
I'm a Suns fan, so I'm rooting against.
So I don't think that one goes down just because of the mechanics. I think that he starts the season on the team because I think they will hold out. I think they can kind of reset a little mini tank this season if they wanted to. It's not the worst thing in the world for him to sit just because they have their one pick this year that swaps with Houston, who's also probably going to be bad. So they can kind of tank it for one season if they really want to. Now, that being said, having Kyrie Irving and Ben Simmons on the team makes it hard. It makes it almost impossible to do that. So they get in a weird situation there. I think that this is like not sourced or anything. I think that the ultimatum that Durant threw out there was probably mostly not fake, but a way to kind of push his way out the door rather than a real ultimatum about Marks and Nash. I wonder sometimes, only because you mentioned Simmons, I wonder sometimes what the deal is there with these guys, because we've talked about this in the podcast. Again, not reporting anything. So little is said about how these guys, like the time that these guys have spent together or like each other or whatever, that makes me wonder if Durant has had real questions about even just playing with Simmons. By the way, we said this well in advance of like whatever Rick Bucher and all these other guys said. Like we said this a month before that, just wondering about like, hey, it's weird how little you hear about this, right? It's weird how little you hear about from these guys talking, interacting, wanting to play together. From the last year. So I wonder if he's just kind of looked around the room at what the Nets currently are, Simmons included, and the rest of the team, and just said, I can kind of see how this is going to work. And it's just not going to work for us. So I get a little worried about the situation there. I think that what's going to happen is he is ultimately going to, they're not going to trade him because they're not going to get a package. They're going to go into the season and they're going to do the Sixers and Simmons thing last year, which is like he probably sits out. He's already got paid because the contract, the first round of the contract came once, and he's going to get the second one prior to the season starts. So it's not going to be a money thing. I think he ends up sitting a little bit, and then wait to see how the NBA landscape unfolds for the first little bit of the season and see if there's another team that can now talk themselves into it. Because we know that, one thing we know about the NBA is whatever you think is the case now around teams, it doesn't take long to change. Case in point, the Nets last year, when they went in as the favorites, and by the trade deadline, we got hit by 400 pounds of shrapnel and Harden's out the door, and it's for Ben Simmons. Like life comes at you really fast here. So the part where there will be, it might not be more teams, but there will be different teams that will probably start talking themselves into the Durant thing. Maybe a young player looks better at that point. Like there's, like you said with the Knicks, like maybe your young players that we don't think are valuable now do look more valuable now, right? Like because so many things change. So my ultimate guess is goes into the season, sits out. We've seen him multiple, like you mentioned the Twitter thing with Tommy at the beginning of this podcast, right? It's like the dude is very comfortable with who he is. Like he does not care. Like that, I think we can clearly say that now. He does not. There's no narrative around him that he doesn't care to like clap back at, right? So I don't think if he felt comfortable sitting, he would have any problem doing it. The part where like, oh, Kevin Durant will never do it because he's a player. Like, dude, Kevin Durant asked for a trade. No one ever thought he was going to do that. So you can't prescribe previous actions on the future things that this guy's going to do. I think he goes into the season. He does not play. And they kind of wait to see how the rest of the landscape unfolds, feeling comfortable about maybe reclamating some of Simmons's value. Maybe Kyrie looks a little more enticing to a Lakers team or something like that. Like, I don't know. I don't think the trade's going to happen. And I don't think he puts a Nets uniform on again.
Yeah, I sort of feel the same way. That Twitter exchange with Tommy Beer that we've referenced a couple of times has been pretty telling today, because it seemed like Durant was really going to bat for the idea of like, so what if I sit? Other players do it, and teams are sitting healthy players during the season to tank and blah, blah, blah. Like, why isn't that a big deal? And it's like, yeah, I mean, We rag on that all the time on this show about like that's why we think if things don't work out with Donovan Mitchell, maybe Shai Gilgeous-Alexander is the next guy to shake loose, because how many guys want to be in their mid-20s in their prime as a superstar being sat so their team could tank for half the year,
like season 4 of a tank or whatever.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? Like, so whatever.
But yeah, I'm with you with the Durant situation. That's kind of my read on it too, and I don't cover the guy every day, thankfully. So I don't know. I probably don't have nearly the finger on the pulse that you do, but I feel like it's going to hit that point too, where he's either going to sit or he's going to do like the Harden in Houston and just like massively mail it in and like show up obviously not caring and just try to tank the locker room so much.
That's actually the one thing I think he won't do. I actually don't think he'll do that. Now, again, I'm going to argue against myself here because I just said, we've never seen that before. So that whatever I said before doesn't help my argument there. I actually don't think he would do that, because I think the one thing we have seen is that he has tons of pride. It's just not the way fans want that pride to sometimes go, right? Like sometimes fans want that pride to be whatever uniform or whatever laundry you're wearing at the moment. That's what you're most prideful about. I think he has a pretty good track record of saying that actually piece doesn't seem to matter to him too much, right? Like, because he's going to just go wherever he feels like he wants to go. And he's done that now. Well, he's done it twice and he's about to do it a third time. So, but I do think like Kevin Durant as the guy, as the player, I do think he would not do that. I don't think he would come and just half loaf it around the court. I don't think he has that in him. And frankly, I don't think the Nets would want him to do it either, because there'd be injury risk and there's other stuff. Like, unless they were fully committed to knowing that he was going to come back, I don't see how the Nets are incentivized to throw him on the court in that situation, because even if he just dogged it, which I don't think he would do, you do kill the trade market by having him twist something, tweak something, tear something. Like there's so much downside to a situation like that. So I don't think that one happens, but yeah, dude, he's just an interesting guy. Like I can see why he's a polarizing guy. I can see why people probably either like can't stand him or just absolutely love it, with very little in between, because it kind of speaks to probably how you root for the NBA, what you think of like the superstar era, what you think about teams. I think this actually does embody a lot of like how fandom has drawn their lines right now. This one is that like coming to an absolute head. The other ones have just been interesting. You have your Harden stands, your Simmons stands, the guys that kind of people that hang around rooting for a player. This one actually, I think, really is drawn very divisively around how you view the NBA and their superstars, because whether you like Durant, you either like Durant and you love what he's doing here, or you just cannot stand him and you think he's everything wrong with the NBA. I just kind of see both sides.
All right, so let's wrap on this. Is there where we started? Is there any world where the Knicks or Nets could make a deal? And much to the chagrin of myself, Alex, and all Knicks fans, I think if anything were to happen, it would be around Kyrie Irving, just because I don't think I think a Kevin Durant trade would involve RJ Barrett, and I think that would be a non-starter for the Knicks. Maybe I'm off on that. And Doug, like, let me know if you think it would get to a point where like the Nets would kind of be like, yeah, we'll just take a ton of picks. To me, that wouldn't be very appealing for them unless it was some kind of 3-team trade that had the Nets getting Donovan Mitchell somehow, because they obviously owe all their pick equity to the Rockets, and the Nets aren't planning on tanking anytime soon. So going all in on that direction seems a little weird. Maybe they would do it just as an asset play and say, all right, we'll take your picks. We'll take Obi Toppin. We'll take Emmanuel quickly. And then for the Knicks, Kevin Durant even in a world where they give up no players for Durant, which seems impossible because there's just not enough picks in the world for that to happen. I don't think they're title contenders if they got him. And for the Knicks, I think it's much more palatable to have a long runway with a Donovan Mitchell than say you have to be a top 3 team in the NBA right now to justify trading for a 34-year-old Kevin Durant, who was incredible for most of last year. And a lot of people consider him the best player in the NBA, but maybe showed small signs of slowing down a little bit by the end of the season. So I'm poo-pooing my all question, but what do you think about all that, Doug?
Now, I don't. Well, okay, I'll say I don't think it is going to happen, because I think the money to make it work would probably involve like Randall or whatever, and like I don't think that they have interest in doing that. I will say, so I think the answer is no. I don't think the Knicks really have even the assets to really throw it back. Because I think just in terms of what you've heard the Nets kind of wanting, right, which is a la the Simmons trade, which they want a big player back, right? You got at least one really good established player has to come back. Where I do think it's interesting, though, is I do think with this Marks crew, I don't think they'd be opposed. I don't think they would care at all if they were trading him to the Knicks. Let me put it that way. Like, I don't think they care about that part that much. I think that they've shown that they will just trade up. If the deal is right, they will trade the guy. It doesn't matter if, you can take a cab over to see him or not, right? Like, I think that they would do it if the Knicks had the right package. They would consider it, and it wouldn't matter to them. And I think that's correct, by the way, because there's just too few teams in the NBA. You can't limit who you trade somebody to just because of geography or fan bases or anything like that. If there was 150 teams, you could start thinking about it. There's only 29 other teams you can trade with. You are doing yourself a disservice to not think about it because it's a little too close to home, right? So I don't think the Knicks piece of it would stop them from doing it. I just don't think the Knicks have the exact stuff they're looking for, which is starting with at least a name recognition player. Whatever we think about RJ, like, he's good. I think he's going to be better. Having him be the centerpiece of around Kevin Durant, I mean, it would be probably really tough for him. The pressure on him would be way, way beyond what it is now, right? Like, to have him just be, it's hard enough being a high draft pick. If you get traded for Kevin Durant, like, you're going to have to perform. And I just don't think he's the pedigree of player that would be a starting point. So I would say it's more about the Knicks assets or lack thereof, and less about, like, oh, it's James Dolan, it's Joe Tsai. Like, I don't think these people actually really care about that. That maybe some owners do, and some GMs do. I don't think the Nets are one of those teams.
Yeah, I'll just quickly say I don't really see them as a fit either. I think that ultimately what's going to happen, like what would happen in that scenario is sort of like what you said. Like, the Knicks would try their hardest to sell Julius Randle as being okay, like Julius Randle and Ben Simmons and, a built out roster. And now you're going to have a ton of picks. Like, you can figure this out. Like, both those guys are signed for a long time. They're both pretty much in their primes, like maybe Randle, they can build an offense that's more Randle centric again, which the Knicks, that was part of why he got like really unhappy last year. But that is like a 2010 and 5 player that then, the Nets could sell to the fan base is like, hey, look, semi reclamation project, but as long as we get his head straight, like, Randall's a pretty darn good player. But I think the Nets would be like, like, we'd probably prefer someone that's going to meld a little better. Randall this past year proved that the shooting was very empty gym centric, it seems. And so the shooting isn't as much a thing as we thought it was, which then complicates things when you're pairing him with maybe the single worst shooting player in the NBA in Ben Simmons, especially given the position he plays and the expectations that come along with being a lead ball handler in the NBA these days. So not great in that regard. So that would be a huge sticking point. Otherwise, assets wise, I think they stack up pretty good. It's just like, if that's the Nets' main thing, is they're like, we want a guy that we can like immediately turn around and, I don't know about contend with, but at least be like a mid playoff seed with again. I don't know if the Knicks can necessarily do that. But draft picks wise, just like in the Mitchell scenario, there's definitely no team better equipped just on that front than the Knicks, other than like the Thunder right now, or maybe like the Rockets, Jazz. Yeah, I mean, but none of them are going to go after Durant, because Durant would just do the same thing there and be like, I'm not playing here. Right. I'm not playing for the freaking Thunder again. Like, I don't want to come back here and be on a tanking team.
Dude, him and Poku would be a problem.
Though. Yeah, him and Poku. Now we
skinny
can talk about
team
him
for sure.
Yeah, him, Chet, Poku, Shea, the all skinny lineup. Yeah. But anyway, yeah, that's where I'm at too. So I'm with you, Doug and Gavin. I just don't really think there's a deal to be made here. I do think maybe the only thing that maybe makes this a little more interesting is if Donovan Mitchell gets traded somewhere other than the Knicks and sets a market, and it's something that's palatable for the Knicks, and the Nets finally just cave and say, all right, well, we thought we were going to be the first domino, but here's the actual domino that we got to follow here, and we'll take a deal similar to the Mitchell trade if the Knicks would then turn around and trade for him. I kind of hope they don't, though, because there's, as we just learned with the Nets, there's no, and as you said, Doug, with the type of guy and player that Durant is, there's no guarantees that Durant's not going to just turn around in a year from now and say, I don't want to play here anymore. Like, send me somewhere else and hold the Knicks hostage then. So, we'll see how it all goes. But I think we've probably reached our logical endpoint of this podcast. Unless anybody else has any, do either of you have any final statements before we?
Well, my final
sign
statement
off?
was I felt really confident thinking he wasn't going to go to the Knicks, and then as you were kind of walking through a scenario where there was like maybe a little likely, I found myself really rooting against that. So I'm going to. So while I don't think it's going to happen, I had maintained some sanity, maybe probably by thinking there was just no way it was going to happen, and the fact that you introduced a minor world where it could makes me not want to see that happen. So go wherever you want, get paid wherever you want, please. Let's just not have to be the Knicks. I don't know if I want to.
That's
talk
good.
about that. I don't have to talk about that for like a few months. That feels like not what I want to do.
A nice acrimonious note to end an otherwise civil podcast on. Thank you so much, Doug Norrie. I know this will be airing on your side too. But before we send you off, can you tell Knicks fans where they can find all your work? Because I know it goes beyond just covering the Nets.
Yeah, at Doug Norrie on Twitter. That's there. You can follow it there. Really appreciate it, guys. And that the same at the Alex Wolfe and at Locked On Knicks over there for the Knicks guys, so that I don't have to throw anything at the end of this podcast for me.
All right, fantastic.
Take it easy, guys.
Cool. All right, cool. That'll work.
All right. Thanks so much, Doug.